Hello, everybody. My name is HariTalari, and I want to thank all of you guys for being here today. I'd like to take a few moments to talk about how Virginia handles their pandemic data. I mean, the pandemic data that we get is incredibly valuable because as a society, it tells us whether we should go on lockdown or how hospitals should handle their facilities. But on a more personal level, we can look at these data points and the data that's provided and see what we want to do as individuals. And do I feel safe going to X location or X place, right? And so the data that we're given is incredibly important in our decision making and how we should make our decisions. So when I was first looking at different dashboards that Virginia had about COVID's data for Virginia, I wanted to see if I could do a little more analysis on it, drill a little deeper into this data. And what I found was pretty interesting, that the way that the data was reported leaves more to be desired. And a lot of the reason for a lot of the generalizations in the dashboards that they show are there because of how they report the data. So those are the two things I'd like to talk about. The issues that the data kind of has and what the data can do well. So if we look here, we can see this dashboard that I created using the Virginia Department of Health COVID data and the population data for the state of Virginia through the census. There's a lot here, but I only want to focus on one or two things. The main one being this line graph right here on the top right. So if we do a little closer look, what this line graph is, it is just the daily death count for the state of Virginia as a whole. And so we can see here, it just for any given day that we look at, it'll just tell us how many deaths were reported on those days. Now, when I was first getting this data and connecting Tableau with it, and I looked at this graph, one of the first things that caught my eye were the fact that there were 383 deaths on the 3rd of March, and there were negative 90 deaths on the 19th of March. Now, there's also -6 on November 6th and stuff, and I was very confused by that because why would there be negative deaths? That makes absolutely no sense. And so the first thing I did was I went to the Virginia Department of Health's website to see, because they have their own dashboards and visualizations, and I wanted to see if they had the same type of line graph. And doing some digging, I actually found a line graph that they had, which was the exact same one that I made. And they also had this 383 deaths and negative 90 deaths on the 19th of March. So it wasn't a problem with my data being bad. It was just the data I was collecting was giving me these results. So I looked further to see why that would happen. And a lot of it has to do with the way that this data gets reported. And it's a big problem because if we have values like this negative 90, I can't look at any given day's data and really critically analyze it because it just isn't worth it because it might be wrong because negative 90 can never happen. So the issue is when they report their deaths, it's not that there were 383 deaths on the 3rd of March. It was just the day that they happened to report that they just happened to be 383 deaths since the last time they were reporting it. And the negative 90 is because the data, they might misreport on certain days. They might accidentally misreport some deaths. They might give more deaths on one day than they should have. And so instead of going back on previous days and fixing those records, on the next day, they'll just subtract whatever the value was and you'll get a negative 90. And that's a problem because as we look at this data, when we try to drill deeper into this data, we can find that we can't really deeply analyze it for that reason. Now, it's not all bad. If we look here down at the bottom right, we can see a heat map of the state of Virginia in all of its counties. It just shows like the cases per capita of 100,000 population. And the darker means the more case that county had compared to other counties. Now, if we hover over any given county, we can see a few metrics. We can see what the contamination rate is for that county. So for Betra County, there were 7% of the population has had COVID since the pandemic began. And we can get good generalizations out of this data because if we're only looking at what's happened on a broad sense, we can generally see what kind of trends are happening here. And that is valuable in its own sense. It's just more so when we get deeper into it that we can see problems that we've seen in this line graph. And so just to conclude, the two main points that I wanted to hammer in this presentation were the way that the data is being reported leaves more to be desired. And the data isn't horrible. It's pretty good, honestly, when you're trying to just get generalizations on what's going on. I'd like to take a moment to just thank my mentor, Robbie Hilton Smith. He's a data scientist at 1901 Group. He helped me a lot throughout creating the data pipeline of getting the data, preparing it for visualizations and dashboards, as well as giving me his thoughts while I was in the process of creating visualizations in my dashboards. Thank you.
Hari, excellent presentation, really good project. Neat how you were able to show your data and the state's data. I have one question while we're waiting for other questions from the audience. Did you consider at all the impact of security and privacy? And can you talk just for a second about how that may impact the data that the state actually gives out to the public?
Yes. Let me share my screen one more time. I just turned it off. I think there's a good example of that. So if we look here at my dashboard for a quick second, we can see this age partition. And so since we're looking at deaths right now, I can just hover over and I can see any given age group, but the age groups are from 60, they're in groups of 10. So I couldn't drill deeper than the age group of 60 to 69. And that is, I'm pretty sure the reason that they only give that sort of data, that aggregated data, is like you said, for security purposes, which is merited. But when we're talking about reporting the data, like even though they're using these sort of security measures, that doesn't have an effect on how the data should be reported. Because if we can get all that aggregate data reported in a manner that we can drill down deeper into, then that would have been perfect. But yeah, I think security is probably, and anonymity is probably one of the most important things that that the Department of Health is thinking about when they're releasing this data to the public.
Right, especially with medical data. We're all familiar, I think, with the challenges around HIPAA. So I'm sure the state chose to be conservative, but you've raised some good issues in your project, definitely. Do we have any other questions for Hari? Oh, it looks like we have a couple here. Are you able to see the Q&A, Hari?
Yes, I'm trying to find out what the...
Dr. Barlin, that's a good question.
That's a good question. What reporting feature? That's an interesting question. Like when we say feature, I guess like I would have some sort of like process, I guess, for like a hammer down process for how we decide when we report data that's like set in stone, because I feel like a lot of it has to do with, I feel like there's a lot of ambiguity in how they're reporting it, because even through my, like when I was trying to figure out how this data is reported, it was very difficult to find exactly what the process was and when they actually report anything and how they grab that data. Does that answer your question, Dr. Barlin? I'm gonna go to the next question. How difficult was it to generate this dashboard when using Tableau? I think Tableau for making dashboards is quite difficult, honestly. I think making visualizations in Tableau is really good. It's very streamlined. I feel like it's not too difficult to learn, but I think the dashboarding is kind of clunky in a few senses, like when you're trying to like put things in specific areas and whatnot. But I think the visualizations are quite easy to make. Dr. Bradbury asks, would it be possible to break apart your data in such a way that you could include natural interventions that would cause an uptick in contagion, for example, marking when Virginia Tech and Radford return to classes? Yes, I think that would be possible. I would probably put that would be in like my data preparation. I think I could definitely set those. And even in Tableau, you can set different intervals of time for stuff like that. So if you could set like in your visualizations, for example, in Tableau, you could set like if you knew when we were coming back to classes, you could mark those dates for to look at more closely, and you can have those set differently in your visualizations as well. Yeah, I think that's it.
Do you have a couple?
Oh wait, there's. Oh, I didn't. I
Yep.
see more. I'm sorry. Yeah. So, are there any techniques to subtract values like that from your previous day's data? So when I was creating this, when I was creating that visualization, my line graph, before I could create that line graph, what I did was in my data, in my database that I had created, that I got all this data from, I had my own personal database, and I ran a bunch of analytical queries, like the lead, the lag queries, and I ran those on the COVID data, so I could get the individual day-by-day breakdown. That was the only way I was able to do it, because they do additive sums on the data. So like you can't, like the data by itself isn't broken down day by day. So I just ran a few queries on it, and I made tables on those queries that I then connected to Tableau. Given the response the government have taken, do you think there are ethical issues not considered in the responses? In addition, do you have a myriad of responses non-consistent? So I think when it comes to the ethical issues that are not considered, I don't really know. I feel like the anonymity that me and Dr. Pickus were talking about is the most important part. And I think they do generally a good job with that. I mean, I think in a sense, it's hard for us as the public to really hammer down a few things because of it. But I think the government does a pretty good job keeping everything anonymous for when we're looking at this sort of data. I haven't done too much. I didn't look too deeply on the security and the ethical issues of it. But I think through the data that I've collected and looked at, I think it wasn't too bad. Let's see. So how would you change the reports to be clear for the general public to understand? I think the main thing with that is setting up a plan for how we report this data. I think it would be if we can set like a concrete plan for how we want to report this data to not allow for that, I think that would be great. So maybe like if we misreported deaths and we know for sure, and we can know for sure and track which dates those misreported deaths run, and we just went back and changed those days on a daily basis, then we would never have those negative problems. And I think that would be a great way for a solution for that specific issue with the line graph that I showed. But when it comes to, there are a lot of other issues for that come up when I was analyzing other data sets. So, but for that one particular problem, I think that would be good. But I feel like there needs to be more structure in the way that the reporting happens. Wondering if additional data around responses coupled with this. Coupled with this would provide better responses in the future. Yeah, I think additional data could only help, but I wonder because I wonder where that data would come from. I feel like additional data sources help for adding more context for sure, but I feel like when it comes to getting like the COVID data specifically for the state, it's really only around the like VDH provides like the majority of it. So for Virginia, but yeah, I think so. So are you able to check the same data error with other sources like Johns Hopkins University's report? Does the same thing reported on overall US data? I haven't checked for overall US data or other reports. The only other report I saw was, I know when, I think it was the Times that I looked at, when they did their reports as well for the state of Virginia, they had similar issues. And I believe with their graphs, actually, you can see how they even state how portions of this data are just rough estimates, because the way that the visuals are shown make it seem like there's incredible spikes, but they even state that like those spikes are not like indicative of that actual day. Yeah, I think oh, there's a couple other. Oh, how hard would it be to grab vaccination data and draw another line? If you could, how would you color it? Okay, so you can definitely grab vaccination data. They have APIs for vaccination data. They have quite a bit of it. And that actually started coming in after I'd already started on the project. There really wasn't much vaccination stuff, but now there's a lot that you can do with vaccination data. It wouldn't be hard to have another line for the vaccinations and the cases. You could definitely have those. The way I would color it, I would want to see the lines first, and I would want to know how I would want that visualization would appear for the lines. So if I noticed that the lines were like the vaccinations were going up and the cases were going down substantially, I'd probably put more emphasis on the vaccine data, and I might give that a brighter color than the cases. You had a set of data reported from the VDH that you had as a source. How would you have attacked the reporting from scratch and not use the VDH formats? That's an interesting question. I don't really know, because I was just going through and looking at where I could get this data. I mean, regardless of what format the data was in by the VDH, I would have figured out I would have figured out a way in which I would go about making visualizations and dashboards on it. So it was more so about going around, seeing what data I could find, and then how I could prepare and clean that data in a way that I could make dashboards on it for. So like, for example, with that line graph, the data that VDH gives you doesn't have the day-by-day breakdown. I had to prepare that in a way where I could get day-by-day breakdowns. And so I think it's more of getting the data, finding out where I can get this data, getting that data, and then preparing it in a way where I can make dashboards on it or visualizations or whatever I'm looking at.
Hari, excellent job answering some challenging questions. Great project, very relevant, obviously. Really enjoyed this one.